The cowboy accepted the payment without ceremony, though something about it sat uneasy in his chest. The trader avoided his eyes, talking too fast as he explained why silver wasn't available and why this Apache girl was worth more than coins. On the frontier, excuses were common, and the cowboy had learned long ago that questions often brought more trouble than answers. Still, when he looked at the girl, he saw none of the fear or dull obedience he expected. Her hands were bound, her clothes worn from travel, yet her posture was straight, her chin lifted as if she refused to let the world see her bow. They rode for hours beneath a burning sky. The girl never complained even when her feet bled against the rocky ground. Once, when the cowboy dismounted to water his horse, she quietly pointed toward a narrow ravine and warned him of loose stone and rattlers. He stared at her, surprised. She knew the land as if it lived inside her. When he asked where she learned such things, she only said, "From my people," and said no more. That night, they camped near a dry creek bed. The cowboy kept his distance, unsure what rules applied to a bargain like this. As the fire burned low, he heard her humming, soft, steady, and heavy with something that made his throat tighten. It was not a song of surrender. It sounded like memory. He realized then that whatever the trader claimed, this girl did not think of herself as owned. Over the next days, she spoke rarely, but when she did, her words were careful and proud. She asked about the land, the cattle, the sky beyond the hills. She never asked about freedom, never begged. That silence troubled him more than pleading would have. One evening, he asked her name. She hesitated, eyes flickering with a guarded light, then gave him a name that felt unfinished, like a door left half closed. He sensed it was not the one her mother had whispered when she was born. As the ranch finally came into view, the cowboy felt a strange weight settle over him. He had taken many payments in his life, horses, guns, gold, but never one that looked back at him with such unbroken will. He began to suspect that this transaction was no simple trade at all, and that by accepting it, he had stepped unknowingly into a story far larger and more dangerous than his lonely stretch of frontier land. The signs appeared at dawn, carved shallow but deliberate into the cottonwood trees near the ranch. The cowboy noticed them while checking the fence line, his hand tightening around his rifle as he traced the familiar marks. They were Apache signals, fresh and purposeful, not the random scratches of hunters passing through. Someone was watching, measuring his land, counting his steps. When he turned back toward the house, he found the girl standing in the doorway, her expression calm but alert, as if she had already sensed what he was about to say. He confronted her that evening as the sun sank red behind the hills. There was no anger in his voice, only the need for truth. For a long moment she said nothing, staring into the fire as sparks rose like restless spirits. Then she straightened and told him what the trader never had. She was not a slave taken in war, but the daughter of a chief whose name carried weight across the desert. Her capture had been a calculated insult, meant to force submission, and her sale was a gamble by a greedy man hoping to disappear before the consequences arrived. The cowboy felt the ground shift beneath him. Every story he had heard about Apache vengeance rushed back, sharpened now by the knowledge that he stood at the center of it. Yet as she spoke, he saw no fear in her, only restrained fury and wounded pride. She did not accuse him, did not beg for protection. She stated the facts as one might describe an approaching storm, unavoidable and powerful. That night he barely slept. By morning, riders appeared on the ridge, silhouettes against the pale sky. They did not attack. They waited. The cowboy walked out alone, leaving his rifle behind, his hands visible. The air was thick with tension, every sound magnified by the stillness. The girl followed him, stopping just short of the open ground, her eyes locked on the figures above. As the riders descended, the cowboy understood that he could still try to bargain, still pretend ignorance and push the blame onto the trader. Instead, he spoke plainly, admitting how the payment had been made and how the truth had come to light. He placed himself between the girl and the approaching warriors, a silent declaration of where he stood. For the first time in years, survival was no longer his only guide. Honor, long neglected, had finally found its voice on the open frontier. The Apache chief arrived without ceremony, his presence commanding silence as completely as a drawn weapon. Age had lined his face, but his eyes were sharp, carrying the weight of countless battles and losses. He listened as the cowboy spoke, his voice steady despite the tension tightening his chest. Every word felt like a step across thin ice. Around them, warriors waited, still as carved stone, ready to move at the slightest sign of disrespect or deceit. Then the girl stepped forward. For the first time since her capture, she lifted her voice freely, speaking in her own language, her words flowing with strength and certainty. She told her father of the traitor's lies, of the attempted humiliation, and of the cowboy who had accepted her as payment without knowing her true identity. She also told how he had never treated her as an object, how he had listened when she spoke and stood aside when danger approached. As she spoke, the chief's expression softened almost imperceptibly, the rigid lines of command giving way to something deeply human. The silence that followed felt endless. At last, the chief turned his gaze to the cowboy. He did not thank him. Instead, he asked a single question about why a man of the frontier would risk death for someone he barely knew. The cowboy answered honestly, admitting that at first he had thought only of survival, of another day lived without complication. But something in the girl's unbroken spirit had reminded him of who he once believed himself to be, before the land hardened him. That answer, raw and unpolished, carried more weight than any clever defense. The chief nodded slowly. Justice, he said, would be taken from the man who sold his daughter. Blood need not stain this ground today. He offered compensation, gold taken from trade routes, safe passage through Apache territory, and the promise of protection against future raids. The cowboy surprised everyone by refusing payment. He asked only that peace be kept, and that no other child be turned into a bargaining tool. As the Apache prepared to leave, the daughter looked back once, her eyes holding gratitude and resolve. The ranch felt emptier after they were gone, but not hollow. The cowboy stood alone beneath the vast sky, knowing he had lost nothing of value and gained something rare on the frontier. The quiet certainty that, when it mattered most, he had chosen honor over fear. Weeks passed after the Apache rode away, yet their absence lingered like a presence the cowboy could still feel. The land seemed quieter, not with the uneasy silence of danger, but with something closer to respect. No cattle went missing, no warning signs appeared on the trees, and travelers crossed nearby trails without fear. The frontier had not grown gentle, but it had shifted, as if an unseen agreement now rested over the dust and stone. One evening, a familiar figure approached from the south, riding alone and unarmed. The cowboy recognized her before she came close. She sat tall in the saddle, dressed not as a captive but as a woman of her people, her bearing unmistakable. She dismounted at the fence line and waited, giving him the courtesy of choice. When he stepped forward, she greeted him as an equal, her voice calm and steady. She told him her father had sent her, not as repayment, but as a bridge. Trade routes were opening, and the Apache wished for a place where words could come before weapons. The cowboy listened, struck by how naturally leadership rested on her shoulders. This was no longer a girl shaped by captivity, but a woman shaped by purpose. She spoke of balance, of a future where the land did not have to be claimed through blood alone. As they talked, he realized how much the frontier had taken from him without his noticing. Trust, connection, belief in anything beyond the next sunrise. Her visit stirred those losses, but it did not reopen old wounds. Instead, it offered something new. When she asked if he would stand as a witness between their worlds, not as a warrior, but as a man known for keeping his word, he felt the weight of the request settle into his bones. He agreed without hesitation, not because it promised safety or profit, but because it felt like a continuation of the choice he had already made. Before leaving, she handed him a small token carved with the symbol of her family. It was not protection, she said, but recognition. As her figure disappeared into the horizon, the cowboy returned to his ranch with a different kind of resolve. The frontier would always be harsh, but it did not have to be empty of meaning. He had accepted a payment once without understanding its cost. Now he understood its value and the quiet responsibility that came with being remembered by a chief's daughter as a man of honor.